In the early years of his reign, the most powerful man in the world sat surrounded by the wealth of 100 conquered nations, and he was worried, not about a rebellion, not about a foreign army gathering on the frontier, not a plague, not a famine. What troubled Augustus, the man who had ended a century of civil war and made himself master of the known world, was that Roman men were no longer getting married. Just sit with that for a second. The empire was richer than it had ever been. Its roads stretched from the cold rain of Britain to the deserts of the east. Its legions were the most feared force on earth. And yet, in the very heart of this triumphant civilization, fewer and fewer citizens were choosing to build families. Rome could conquer the world. What it could not do was convince its own people to settle down, marry, and raise the next generation. It's a strange paradox. And, honestly, a strangely familiar one, because the questions that kept an emperor awake 2000 years ago are the very same questions echoing through our own time. So let's go back to the beginning. To understand why this frightened a man who feared almost nothing, you first have to understand what marriage actually meant in Rome. It was never just a private arrangement between two people in love. It was the foundation, the structural core of the entire society. The Roman household, the familia, was an economic engine, a political unit, and a military reserve, all at once. At its center stood the pater familias, the male head of the family, a man who held legal authority over his wife, his children, his property, and, at least in the old law, sometimes even the lives within his own walls. Through marriage, property passed cleanly from one generation to the next. Through legitimate children, citizenship was transmitted, and the proud bloodlines of the elite were preserved. Through new births, the legions found their soldiers, the treasury found its taxpayers, the future found its citizens. Marriage, in a very real sense, was the machine by which Rome reproduced itself, not just biologically, politically, economically, culturally. So the state had a direct, obvious, and very personal interest in whether its citizens formed families, because families were where Romans were made. But here's the irony sitting at the center of this entire story. The very success of Rome began, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, to undo the very behavior that had made that success possible. When the Republic was young and hungry, life was simple, and it was hard. Citizens farmed, they fought, they built. There were few alternatives to family life, and almost no distractions from it. Then came the conquests. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, it swallowed unimaginable wealth. Gold, silver, slaves, land, luxury beyond anything the old farmers had ever dreamed. And all of it flowed back into the city. New industries appeared. New fortunes were made overnight, and suddenly a man's horizons widened dramatically. There were now paths to status that didn't run through fatherhood at all. There were ways to spend an entire life that an earlier generation could never have imagined. Ambition itself was changing shape. A Roman man's dreams were no longer limited to inheriting a farm and producing an heir. The world had grown enormous, and so had the appetite for everything inside it. And as those horizons widened, marriage slowly started to look less and less attractive. For a lot of men, the math had simply changed. A wife came with a dowry, yes, but she also came with obligations, expenses, and the long, heavy, uncertain cost of raising children who, in that era, might not even survive their first few years. Family tied a man down at exactly the moment when the world seemed to reward freedom, movement, and risk. There were pressures pulling in both directions, of course, but for an ambitious young man with money and prospects, the advantages of staying single were getting harder and harder to ignore. Marriage no longer felt like the obvious, automatic next step in a good life. It started to look like one option among many, and, increasingly, not the most appealing one. The institution Rome leaned on for its very survival was quietly losing its grip on the imaginations of the very people it needed most. And wealth, in particular, changed everything. As riches piled up in fewer and fewer hands, the Roman elite found themselves locked in a fierce, exhausting competition for status, for influence, for display. The cities swelled with new arrivals, all chasing the same fortune. And urban life offered pleasures and possibilities that quiet, rural family life never could. In that environment, individualism flourished. A man with means could enjoy a long, comfortable bachelorhood, full of entertainment, full of personal advancement, full of choice, marrying late, if he married at all. The more options a person had, the easier it became to keep putting off the commitment that marriage demanded. And here's the real twist. Prosperity, which should have made family life easier to afford, instead made it easier to delay. The incentives had quietly flipped. The richer Rome became, the weaker the pull toward the household grew, because wealth bought one thing above all else, the freedom to live differently. Now, this wasn't some hidden trend, invisible until later historians dug it out of the rubble. The Romans noticed, and they complained, loudly, constantly. Moralists mourned the decline of the old hard virtues. Senators worried out loud about empty cradles and an aging, shrinking citizenry. Writers mocked the men who chased pleasure and dodged the duties their fathers had embraced without question. The falling marriage rate became a genuine public anxiety, debated in the same breath as war, taxes, and politics. This was no longer treated as a private choice that concerned only the two people involved. It had become, in the public mind, a crisis of the state itself. A slow, silent erosion of the foundation Roman power was built upon. The bachelor was no longer just a man quietly living his own life. In the eyes of the establishment, he had become a threat to the future of Rome itself, and it was into this thick atmosphere of worry that Augustus finally stepped. Here, the story shifts from quiet diagnosis to forceful, deliberate action. Augustus did not see falling marriage rates as some harmless curiosity. He saw them as a clear and present danger to the empire he had spent his whole life assembling. So he did what powerful states have always been tempted to do. When private behavior collides head-on with public need, he legislated. Around the close of the 1st century before the Common Era, he introduced a sweeping package of laws aimed directly at the bedroom and at the household. The most famous of them were the Lex Julia and, a little later, the Lex Papia Poppaea. Together, they stand as one of history's earliest and most ambitious attempts by a government to actively engineer the family lives of its own citizens. The emperor would no longer simply hope that Romans would marry. He would reward those who did, and he would punish those who refused. The tone of the entire age had changed. The private had become political, and the mechanics of these laws, they were strikingly, almost shockingly direct. Men who stayed unmarried faced real, biting penalties, including sharp restrictions on what they were legally allowed to inherit. Childless couples were limited in how much they could receive from the wills of others, and in a society where inheritance meant status, security, and survival, that was no small thing. Meanwhile, those who married and produced children were rewarded generously. Fathers of several children gained legal privileges, faster advancement in public careers, preferential treatment in 100 small but meaningful ways. The state was now reaching directly into private life, attaching hard financial and political consequences to the most intimate decisions a person could ever make. The logic behind it was simple, almost mathematical. If marriage and children had become economically unattractive, then the state would simply change the math. It would make staying single costly, and it would make parenthood profitable. Behavior, the emperor was certain, would obediently follow the incentives, and yet the reforms failed. Not immediately, not completely, but in the one way that truly matters, they did not solve the problem they had been so carefully designed to solve. People found their way around the laws, almost as fast as the laws themselves appeared. Some entered into hollow marriages of convenience, satisfying the cold letter of the statute without ever fulfilling its actual spirit. Others arranged careful formal engagements that pushed the penalties off again and again, indefinitely, and the wealthy elite, who had the very most to lose, naturally also had the very most resources to quietly slip away. Loopholes were discovered, exploited, refined, and passed along like family heirlooms. But the deeper reason the reform struggled, it had almost nothing to do with clever evasion. It was this: the laws attacked the symptoms, while leaving the root causes completely, stubbornly untouched. The forces driving men away from marriage were structural, economic, woven directly into the very prosperity and ambition that Rome itself had so proudly cultivated. No penalty on bachelors could undo the simple, stubborn fact that a wealthy, urban, opportunity-rich society had made the single life genuinely, rationally appealing. Augustus was fighting the consequences of Rome's own success with the blunt instrument of law, and law all by itself could not reverse a transformation that ran that deep into the bones of the society. This is the turning point of the entire story, the exact moment where the limits of institutional power become impossible to ignore. So, what happened next? Rome did not collapse. And that, honestly, might be the most surprising part of all. The empire did not crumble because men married late or chose not to marry at all. Instead, society adapted. New patterns of family life slowly emerged. Households took on different shapes and sizes. Relationships, inheritance, and daily arrangements quietly evolved to fit the lives people were actually living, rather than the lives the law demanded. What one generation had loudly called a crisis gradually became, to the next, simply the way things were. The moral panic faded into the ordinary background hum of everyday life. Rome absorbed the change, the way societies almost always do, and it went on. The dire predictions of total ruin never quite came true, at least not in the dramatic way the moralists had feared. The transformation that had so deeply alarmed Augustus turned out to be something the civilization could live with, adjust to, and carry forward, even if it never again looked quite like the world those old laws had been written to protect. And this is the moment the Roman story stops being only about Rome, because the pattern it reveals appears again and again and again, all across history. Whenever a society grows wealthy, urban, and crowded with new opportunity, the old incentives that once made family feel natural and necessary begin to weaken. You can see the echo in the industrial age, when people poured into the cities and traditional family structures bent and cracked under entirely new pressures. You can see it in many modern nations today, where rising prosperity has arrived almost everywhere, hand in hand with later marriages, smaller families, and falling birth rates. Now, the easy move here is to grab a quick, lazy comparison, to shrug and say history is just repeating itself. But the truer, far more interesting point lies quietly beneath the surface. It isn't about morality. It isn't about willpower. It isn't about people simply becoming worse. It's about incentives. When the deep structures that once rewarded family life begin to change, behavior changes right along with them. Not because people have grown selfish or weak, but because they are responding, rationally and understandably, to a genuinely different world. The specific details differ wildly across the centuries, but the underlying mechanism stays remarkably, almost eerily consistent, which brings us at last back to Augustus, sitting at the very height of his power, troubled by a problem he simply could not command away. He had understood something that governments have been forced to rediscover in nearly every era since. Laws can shape behavior at the margins. They can nudge, they can reward, they can punish, but they very rarely succeed in reversing the deep economic forces that quietly decide how people live, whom they marry, and how they imagine their own futures. 2000 years ago, Rome stumbled straight into a dilemma that still quietly challenges modern societies today. When the structures that once made family formation attractive begin to shift beneath our feet, can any government truly turn the tide? Or are these vast demographics changes far less a matter of policy and far more a reflection of how ordinary people experience opportunity and risk and the uncertain, unwritten shape of the future itself? Augustus never found his answer. And maybe the more honest question is this: has anyone in any age, in any empire, ever truly found it at all?